Hi there, I'm Colin Klupik, and this is the dovetail joint. It's a very well-known method of joining timber. It's a favourite of many, and it's a mystery to many. And it's a wonderful thing to do with your students because it really is quite a challenge for them. It's simple in principle, but actually putting one together, marking it out, cutting it out, making it work is quite a challenge. It's a great thing to demo to your students, and it's a great thing to do with your students. Now, there are many ways to go about making a dovetail joint, and I suspect that this video, or what I'm about to demonstrate to you, is going to be, well, rather polarizing, because people will say, oh no, but I do it this way. Well, to all of those people, great. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how you do it as well. But I'm going to show you a method that was shown to me by a craftsman who taught me this, well, it was a long time ago now. And it seems to work pretty well, and it's repeatable, so you can use the same method to create a single dovetail or a double or a triple or however many you want on a piece of timber on a corner where two bits of timber are coming together. And it's worked really well with students. So let's have a look at how we make it, and then we'll mention a couple of things again at the end.
Firstly, and this may sound rather boring, you're going to need a really sharp pencil, so make sure you have one of those. This joint also requires the use of a sliding bevel. You don't see this used much in school workshops, and many don't really know what it's for, but you'll soon see why this is important. First, we need to mark out the angle or the slope of the dovetail. That angle is what gives the joint its signature angled or tapered appearance. Usually this angle is based on a slope of 1 in 4, sometimes 1 in 3, but usually 1 in 4. We can mark that out as a reference on the pieces we're working with. It's a good idea to do that because if you accidentally change the angle of your sliding bevel, you always have a reference point to set it from again. Since this joint is an interlocking joint, we need to mark out the thickness of the joint around the end of each piece. This will become clear as we work through the joint. And here you can see the two pieces with the thickness marked right around the end. The first part of the joint to be marked out is the tail, or the pin. Now, some people choose to mark the socket first, but I found this method to work quite well, and it seems logical. The base of the pin is usually 3/4 of the thickness of the material in from the sides. Since this timber is 19 millimeters thick, 3/4 is equal to about 15 millimeters, but that would make the base of the pin way too narrow. The 3/4 rule is a guide and not set in stone, so to make the joint look more proportioned, I'll come in 10 millimeters from each side, and you'll see what I mean as the joint takes shape. It's from these 2 points that the angle of the tail will start. The trick is to find a way to accurately hold the sliding bevel on the end of such a narrow piece of timber, but with a bit of perseverance, you'll find the right way to hold it. Remember, the bevel has been set to the correct angle. You just need to find out how to make that work on the timber. One thing you can do to help this is to sketch onto the timber where the angle will go. That makes it easier to predict how to place the sliding bevel onto the timber to get the angle right. Try to hold the sliding bevel firmly against the timber to stop it from slipping. Then accurately mark the angle using your very sharp pencil. If it doesn't look exactly symmetrical, then make the adjustment as necessary. And I can see from this one that I need to mark another line to make that happen. It means that I'll end up with a double line, which looks a bit messy, but that will get cut away. To make sure I'm cutting the right one, I'll mark it with a small arrow. Let your students know that it's okay to make errors like this and fix them. After all, we're working with pencil on timber here, and not a CAD drawing or a virtual 3D model. Then we need to project those markings across the top of the timber and onto the other side to complete the marking of the tail. At this point, it's really important to mark out which is the waist. So many times I've seen students cut away the tail instead of the waist. It sounds crazy, but it happens.
One of the really important things about cutting a really nice, accurate dovetail is to have a really good quality saw. Now this saw here is probably a little bit big for the job, but it's pretty typical of what you'll find in a school workshop. And in fact, what you'll find in school workshops is potentially quite random. It's unlikely that you'll have a really nice set of professional dovetail saws, but that doesn't mean that you can't achieve the result of a really nice dovetail. So I'm going to use this one. It's like I said, it's a generic tenon saw, general purpose, and we'll see how we go with that.
To cut the waist, you can either cut on an angle, or you can place the timber into the vise on an angle and then cut straight. I prefer to cut straight, so I'll vise the timber on the angle. Very carefully, with fingers well clear and pointing in the direction of the cut, not across the cut, start to cut away the waist. Keep a close eye on your cutting direction to ensure you don't go off course. Flip it around and repeat for the other side. Then pause to check your accuracy. You can see here that this will need to be pared back with a chisel. Flip the timber on its side and then make the cut to remove the last bit on both sides. Try to keep this cut as perpendicular as possible. You can make minor adjustments by chisel later, but it's better if things are accurate from the start. Now, take your sharpest chisel and begin to pare out those last little pieces of timber to get nice, clean, well-defined edges and faces. Notice I've got my fingers well clear of the blade. As my TAFE teacher used to say all the time until it was ringing in my ears, fingers always behind the cutting edge. Many teachers get a bit edgy about this kind of paring, if you'll pardon the pun, but it's quite safe if your fingers are always behind the blade.
So we've got this far. We've marked out the pin or the dovetail, and that looks pretty good. But where do we go from here? Well, we actually use this as a template to mark out the socket, which is really quite clever. So what happens is that you actually use this part to mark out the opposite interlocking part, which means that you can actually make the two parts to fit together for each other.
Place the second piece for the socket into the vise and then place the tail over the end. Using your sharp pencil, trace the angle of the tail. This ensures that what you cut is exactly what is transferred onto the other piece of timber. Then project those lines vertically down to the line that marks the thickness of the timber. You'll see how this comes together shortly. It's easier to use a small square for this job because larger tri-squares are just, well, too large for this small job. I quite like using this little combination square. Your line marking needs to be very accurate here, as the tail is meant to fit into what is becoming the socket for the joint. You'll see why it's called a socket shortly. Again, clearly mark out the waist. It's very easy for students to cut out the wrong part of the joint, just like they do on the tail section. Make several vertical cuts to cut away most of the waist. Start from the edge of the socket and work your way in. You can make as many cuts as you like. Remember that the more you cut out with the saw, the less you need to chisel away later. Using your very sharp chisel, begin slowly chipping the timber away. You can start at the top or the bottom, but I prefer to start at the top and gently chip away until I reach the bottom. Somehow I just find this steadies the process. The last cut down the bottom needs to be super accurate because this will form the flat surface for the pin to butt up against. So try to be really careful here. Then turn the timber around and do the same for the other side. In this close-up view, the timber isn't clamped because it's a better view for the camera. But you can see how clamping or holding the job is far superior and worth the effort. Notice here how I'm trying to get a clean cut across the base of the joint. This can be very tricky. Then slowly chip away from the reverse side until you work your way down to the bottom. Some of the timber will just want to fall away, whereas other bits will be a little bit more resistant. You can also place the timber flat on the bench with a clamp and cut across the base of the joint. It depends a bit on how much needs to be removed. The socket shape is now becoming more apparent. Some more paring and adjusting is required to get the edges and faces smooth, sharp and well defined. This can take a bit of effort, but it's worth it. Then try and make the pieces fit. Not bad for a rough cut, but you can see here that more adjustment is required. And that's really all it is. Keep taking the timber out of the vise to check where the extra bits need to be removed, pare them out, and try again. Eventually you'll end up with something that works really well. And it's a very satisfying feeling when you actually get it to work. An important thing to note here is that the joint was marked and cut in a particular way. That is, the tail and socket won't be exactly symmetrical, they were cut for each other. They might fit together, but it won't be exactly right, and as you can see here, there is a small bit of misalignment. It's actually meant to fit the other way round. One way to remember that for this demo piece is to write demo on the outside faces of each piece of timber. You can also write 1 in 4 as a reminder that you're using a 1 in 4 slope. And there you have a really useful demo joint that you can keep in your workshop for students to refer back to. Something I've found very helpful in the past as well is to always make another demo with the students as they make one. That way, you can always keep your best one. Plus, they get a bit dog-eared after being handled hundreds of times, so it's handy to replace them from time to time.
Well, there it is, the single dovetail. I enjoyed making that. I think you will too, and I think your students will enjoy it as well. It's one of those projects that just seems to have quite a bit of mystique about it. Everybody seems to want to know how to make a dovetail. I would also encourage you to have one of these in demo mode like this in pieces in your workshop, because the amount of times students have interacted with the demos that I've made is really quite extraordinary. They just seem to want to come up and pull it apart and examine it and see how it all fits together. It's one of those jobs that is really good for developing curiosity in your students. So I encourage you to try that yourself. I encourage you to try it with your students and see how you go. We'll see you in the next video. Oh, and one more thing. The dovetail joint is actually one of those that does benefit quite a lot from the gluing and sanding and finishing process. And that's because there are a lot of little gaps and cracks and things where the joint actually has to fit together. And the glue does a pretty good job of taking up some of those gaps. And then when you do sand and finish, you do end up with a really nice, clean, consistent result. I might do a follow-up video about that.